Good morning, good evening, good night. No matter where you are on this planet, I'm sending you love and light. Check me out. I want to do a part 2 on the ego. The ego clearly has its place, right? We have our place. I want to give you a healthy perspective on this. The ego is just like the negative side of the atom, right? Which means it's supposed to exist. God willed it into existence. It has a purpose. It has a place. When we don't create understanding within ourselves and overstanding, because to govern thine own self is to govern thine own universe, right? Your life. So if you can't govern your ego will govern you. That's when it becomes unnatural. But even that which is unnatural is a part of nature. And I know that because it exists. The paradox. You see what I'm saying? Now, God has allowed the ego to exist. And the ego can be divine. It can serve you. Or you can serve it. You see? There is essentially nothing really wrong with the ego until we start to justify negative perspective, character, and actions behind it. That's when the ego becomes a problem. See, the ego is identity. It's the I, just like Lucifer, just like that guy. It's the me quality. It's you, your name, right? It's your echo chamber, your beliefs, your political beliefs, religious, spiritual, just it's your perspective. And that's fine. God wants you to have your own mind. God wanted you to have your own identity. How do I know this, though? Because you wouldn't have your own identity if God didn't want that. So what is the problem with the ego? The problem with the real ego is this. The ego attaches to all these other emotions. God is love and light. Facts. God is love and light. The soul, the spirit, love and light. God created all, but what is God? What does God want for his creation? It doesn't want destruction. So you must know that although the ego can be an abnormality, paradoxically, even abnormalities are a part of nature, and I know that because they exist. So the trick with the ego is not letting it become infected too deeply with negative perspective and emotion. Not letting it derail you from the path so far that you really lose the perspective of why you're here, what is actually above you outside of your ego, right? And you don't want to lose the perspective of how unhealthy it actually is to not be in control of your own self, your own ego, your own mind. Because come on, God, help me with this one. It's kind of hard. I'm seeing it, but it's hard. It's okay to have identity. It's not okay to identify so far within yourself and your own ego that you can't align with God. You can't be human. You can't align with others. If we all come from one source, then there is truly the potential for finding one school of thought, one line of thought, the spiritual path, right? The righteous path. There is actually that one path, but that path is different for all of us. So it's the same path, but how we get there is going to be different. The rules, there are certain rules that govern us all, and then there are certain rules that govern individuals because of our life test. And your battle with your ego is going to be different from mine. You see? The ego is just like the negative side of the atom. So it has its place. It has its purpose. God willed and intended it to be here. But it's through our free will and our own intentions that we empower the echo chamber, which is the host of the ego, and we allow that ego to attach itself to these emotions and these desires that actually deviate from the path of desire that God had for you. God might desire something greater than what you desire for yourself, but you don't realize it because your ego is running you. To govern thine own self is to govern thine own universe. The ego has a place, it has a purpose. The ego can be a very good thing. It's when you identify too heavily within the ego that you can no longer identify with yourself and you can no longer identify with God. Even God allowed the angels to have names and to speak and to do things, right? We all are servants of God, but even the angels, you know what I'm saying? It's when beings like Lucifer identify so heavily with what they want that they feel it supersedes the nature of God's intentions. And you can't do that because that's wrong. Why is that wrong? Because it's not healthy. And we've seen it so many times historically what a man or a woman's ego given too much power can do to people. It's a destroyer. And it's something that we can't see. To be holy is to be cut off from temptation, to be cut off from sin. But to be truly God is to be cut off from the understanding that we can have for God, because we're not at a high enough vibration. Our consciousness can't really, it's hard to really articulate this thing because it's so far outside of us, but it's also so far within. And you lose that inner monologue. You lose that inner voice when you identify too heavily up here and too externally out into the world in the desires. So you cut yourself off. There is nothing wrong with the ego. There is something wrong with being a human being, and we have to fix ourselves. God designed the ego. It's supposed to be here. It's a part of the test, but it's also something that can be a part of your greatness if you allow it. But also, if you allow it, it could be a part of your demise. The ego is a very, very elusive, tricky thing, but it can be a tool. God said all of these things are my tools. If you walk with God, if you walk with that internal monologue, you are no longer at risk of the weapon being formed against you. You are now a wielder. You can now mold it like a blacksmith. You're shaping it, bow, bow, putting it in the fire. You're shaping this weapon to be used for you and for others. You see what I'm saying? I just want to put a different perspective on the ego. It's clearly paradoxical to consider, but it's also clearly a part of nature. It's supposed to be here. If we could figure out how to control that part of us, we can control our evils. We can control our desires. Desire is largely tethered, not just to your flesh, but to your ego. What does your ego want versus what does your heart want? What does your gut want? What does God want? These are literally all different schools of thought and information. Just a perspective. But they have scientific evidence that lets you know your gut has a thought process. Your heart has a frequency. It has a thought process, bro. You have the internal monologue, that spirit, intuition. And then you have the mind. These are 4 different schools of thought, bro. Your brain is not the only receiver. Our vessel is a receiver, bro. Your skin, your hairs, all of this is a receiver, bro. Know that this is the truth as I see it. If you do enough, if you really look at life, if you really look at God, evil, if you really look at people and you really like study this thing, you'll see the truth in what I'm saying. I'm going to wrap this up with my mantra. Good morning, good evening, good night. No matter where you are on this planet, I'm sending you love and light. I'm gone.